All right, so today we're going to talk about the Byzantine Empire from its beginnings to its fall. Just a quick overview of the Byzantines. The first thing we need to remember is that all of this, all of this goes back to the fall of Rome. We mentioned this last week when we talked about the rise of medieval Western Europe. Now we're going to take a look at what we might call Eastern Europe with the Byzantines. Rome falls. As you know, it is affected by various invasions or movements of what some people used to call barbarian invasions, which more likely people call today German invasion, or some who want to be even more politically correct, I guess we might say German migrations. Movement of Germanic peoples, right? Well, they come into the area being pushed from the steppes of Russia and from the east, and are moving to the west. Some have speculated that perhaps the movement of the Huns from the east had an impact. Some have said perhaps climate change had an impact. Some of these groups are called the Goths. The Goths, G-O-T-H-S. Goths were divided into two main groups, the Visigoths, which means actually the Western Goths, and the Ostrogoths, which are the Eastern Goths. The Visigoths move into the area of Rome in the 4th century and up into the 5th century. They attacked Romania and Bulgaria and Hungary. They run into the eastern part of the Roman Empire, where they are basically encouraged to keep moving, and they do. Their goal was Rome. They sacked Rome in 410. Their leader's name was Ulrich. And Rome falls at this point to the Visigoths. So we're going to see that the western part of the Roman Empire is going to have lots more problems early on than the east, and will actually fall. While the Roman Empire, if you want to call it that, the Roman Empire in the east continues, and will continue for about another 1,000 years. And that's typically what's called the Byzantine Empire. Other invaders that come to the west, the Vandals, I'm sure you've heard of them. The Vandals make their way all the way to North Africa, going around through Spain and coming down to North Africa. Then from North Africa, they come by boats, by ships, and attack Rome from the south, attacking it about 430 and vandalizing Rome. This is where we get our term vandalizing or vandalism. Or vandals. We might say, well, the school was vandalized by, people, vandals. These are basically the idea that they would come in and tear things up. So today we use it of even mild, like spray paint or something. It's vandalism. But in this case, we were talking about they knocked over things, they broke things, they burned buildings. This is what the Vandals did. So we still remember that in our language today. The Huns, who are the only group here I'm talking about that are not Germanic, they are Asiatic, they are coming from Asia. And then most people would claim that the last Western emperor in Rome, even in the midst of all this turmoil, is in 476. Romulus Augustulus, which we mentioned briefly when we talked about Rome. All right, so for all practical purposes then, the western part of the Roman Empire is gone by any vestiges of it by 500. Now, some of these Germanic people thought that they were continuing the Roman stuff. They kind of thought they had inherited the Roman stuff. Most people don't see it that way. But in the east, the Roman Empire continues. Things begin to shift to the east with the coming of an emperor named Constantine, and we've already talked about him, right? Beginning around 330 AD, Constantine having been a part of, been associated with the redistribution, the restructuring of Rome, was really in the west. He and his father were in the west, and after Theodorus dies, we're going to see that Constantine will eventually come to power and come to control everything. But not before there is a major battle, a civil war. In fact, Constantine was in England when he gets the news that the emperor had died and that everything was in turmoil, and his men, his soldiers, proclaim him to be the next emperor. You know, I don't know if they had the power to do that, but that's what they proclaimed him. And so that happened in England, actually, in York. And if you go to the city of York today, which if you get a chance to do, I recommend it. It's a very nice place to visit. Outside the cathedral, there is a nice statue of Constantine and a plaque that commemorates this is the place, this is the town where he rose to power. Well, beginning in 330 then, Constantine, who will move from England, move south, move into Italy, fight his rivals. He crosses the Melvian Bridge. And before he does, he says he saw a vision from God. And that vision was like a big X. And coming up through the X, right through the middle of the X, was a P, which actually is two Greek letters, a chi and a rho. This symbol X with a P, chi rho, you see it sometimes in churches. It's the first two letters of a name. Anybody know what name it is? Christ, yes. Christus. And it said, or he said that he heard or saw, in hoc signo vinces. In this name, conquer. In this sign, conquer. In the sign of Christ. And so he ordered his men to put the chi rho on their shields, on their uniform, you know, on their clothing, and they go into battle and they win. Then he moves further east, and eventually he conquers and takes over all of the Roman Empire. Well, as he moves east, he founds a city there as his new capital. No longer will Rome be the capital. So this is another indication that the West is declining. Even as early as 330 AD, when Constantine makes Constantinople his capital, not Rome. Of course, Rome is still a very important city. But more divisions between East and West, more upheaval in the West. Finally, by 395, the Romans in the East are pretty much separated from any Romans that might be left in the West. And this division is then final. So here is Constantine on this coin. Now we want to jump ahead, not too far, about 120 years, 130 years. We want to go to the time of Justinian, and we want to talk about Justinian because he is the real organizer of the Byzantine Empire in its early period. He'll rule from 527 to 565. And he attempts to recreate the Roman Empire. He's going to do that by trying to recapture the territory of the Roman Empire. You know, he's pretty successful. He takes over most of the Roman Empire, the old Roman Empire, around the Mediterranean. Now, he doesn't have, obviously, he doesn't get control of, say, France, Germany, but Italy, he gets most of Italy. He doesn't get all of Spain, some of the coastal areas there. He gets the coastal areas of North Africa and so forth. So he gets quite a bit of it. Pretty successful at that, although it's quite costly because it's going to take, a lot of military action is not cheap. But he takes much of that territory. We know quite a bit about Justinian because we have good sources of history about him, especially from a man named Procopius. Procopius writes he's the official historian, you might say, the court historian of the Byzantines, of Justinian. But Procopius had his own little project that he was doing himself, which is a secret history, a private history. So there was the public history that he would publish and that Justinian would see and his wife. Then there was the private one that would not be published until they were gone. This is where he dishes all the dirt. This is where he gives us the gossip about the emperor and, of course, especially his wife. His wife. So you're looking for some good names? Justinian, Procopius, or how about his wife's name? Theodora. Theodora, we'll talk about her in a minute. Now here is the map. Kind of hard to see, it's a little bit faded, but there's a sort of lighter pinkish color here. This is the territory he had coming into it, but he adds this little bit darker color here. Over here were the Vandals, he takes over that territory from them. Parts in Spain, Italy, he gets pretty much all of Italy. So he has quite a bit of the old Roman Empire, except for, up in Spain and France, some of these areas where the Germanic tribes are very strong. So he's able to reassemble, even adding Rome back into his territory. All right, so he accomplishes quite a bit. Now let's talk about his wife for a minute, Theodora. By the way, Theodora, her name comes from two Greek words. Theus. What is Theus? That one you might know, right? You ever heard of theology? God, yes. Theus is God, and Dora is from the verb to give. The gift of God. That's really what Theodora means. God's gift. That's not a bad name. I don't hear anybody using it, though. That seems like a pretty good name to me. Theodora. Well, here she is, a mosaic representation of her. She was considered to be a beautiful woman. She was certainly the wife of Justinian. She was the empress. She was considerably younger than her husband, about 20 years. And according to Procopius's secret history, she had somewhat of a scandalous past. He says that she was a dancer. And I don't think he means ballet. I don't know what kind of dancing he means. Because anything that you guys are thinking is not SEU approved, but that's probably what Procopius was talking about, okay? That she was an entertainer, a dancer. In fact, it's even a story where her father was also an entertainer, and sort of the two of them would go out and entertain, but her father had also a bear, a dancing bear. You ever heard of a dancing bear? Well, I'm sure it's all outlawed these days. There probably are no more dancing bears. But they used to be dancing bears. And the bears would entertain people. I can remember, of course, you know, I was Justinian's roommate in college, so I've been around a while. But I remember seeing an entertainment bear. You ever seen a bear up close? Standing up on its hind legs? That's what this bear was doing. Pretty big. Well, you can have a trained bear. You can train a bear. I can even sort of train my dog. Some people are good at it. Well, bear, well, yeah, but the bears are, you know, there could be trained bears. He had a trained bear. You got to start early, got to be patient. I can remember when I was in graduate school, it was in the fall. I remember it was chilly out. And of course, I lived where it actually did get cold, unlike Florida. And it was probably on a Friday or Saturday night. I was walking, probably to go up and get myself some pizza, which would be a normal thing for me. And I hear all this noise, cheering and yelling, you know, which of course you heard a lot about that. It was a college town, Oxford, Ohio. You know, I got 20,000 students and about 5,000 or 6,000 people live in the town. So it's all students pretty much, right? So anyway, when you hear some of that, you kind of wonder, but this sounded a little unusual. So I decided I would walk down that street. I turned the corner, walked down there. When I got down about halfway, I saw something that I thought, what? It was a bear. There was a bar there, and outside of the bar, I don't want you to confuse bar and bear, because some people say bear like bar. But anyway, outside of a bar, there was a bear. And a guy was there with the bear owner, bear trainer, bear whatever, friend. And the bear had a collar around his neck and a big chain, real heavy chain. And the bear was up on his hind feet, kind of like this, right? And huge. I mean, I don't know, 8 feet at least tall, 7 or 8 feet tall, and just massive. You know, bears are huge. Must have been 600 pounds, I'd say. Bears are pretty big. And anyway, what the guy was doing, for a fee, probably like 20 bucks, you could fight the bear. You could wrestle the bear, fight the bear.
Now, did you get the pizza or did you fight the bear?
Well, you know,
The suspense is coming.
yeah. I thought about it, but I decided I would watch first. Yeah, shouldn't have done that, right? And of course, I thought, now who's going to take him up on this? Well, you know, these guys out there, a bunch of frat guys, and they're yelling, yeah, come on, man, you can do it. And so this guy goes, all right, I'm going to do it. And so he gives the guy, you know, the money. And then he says, all right. So the bear knew what was going on. This wasn't the bear's first rodeo. And so the guy comes up, and the guy's trying to grab the bear, you know, and the guy's kind of, you know, grabbing the arm of the bear, and he's kind of trying to push the bear, and the bear is just kind of like. And then, I don't know if the guy with the chain or whatever, at you know, just like a minute into it, and the bear just kind of went whack.
Oh, no.
And the guy went over on the ground, and he was like, oh, you know. And all of his friends were like, oh, you know, they're laughing at him. And then the next guy got up and did it. And I decided, you know what, I don't think, this is a pretty good story, but I don't think I want to have a bear knock me on the ground. So I didn't do it. No, I didn't do it. Yeah, he knocked him down pretty hard. And it could have been a lot harder. It was just kind of it was really nothing. It was just like a bolt, bolt. Of course, probably the bear's leg was like 100 pounds. Bolt. Just came down, and the guy just fell over And that was the end of it. Well, that's an entertaining bear. Entertained me for a little while. And of course, those guys, other guys just lined up. Guys were lined up. I don't know how much money that guy made that night. I bet he made several $100s with his bear. Now, of course, you got to feed the bear, but and transport. I don't know how he transported the bear. Anyway, I didn't stick around for that. But this is what Theodora's father did. He had a bear that would stand up on its hind legs, and he would kind of do a dance. Did anybody try to wrestle it? I don't know if they had that part in their show. But to see a bear, see the bear moving around. Then you bring out Theodora, with her dancing. And they made money that way. Okay? Move from part of town to part of town, move from town to town, whatever. Taking the show on the road and make their money. That's the way they make their living. Well, this was scandalous, But Theodora was also, we learned from the same source, iron-willed. And even though she had this kind of questionable past, she did win the favor of Justinian. They were married. He becomes the emperor. She becomes the empress. And she co-rules with him. Most everyone believes that the co-rulers. She also exhibits great courage. If you ever get to Istanbul, and I hope you do someday, it is really one of my favorite cities in the world, if not my favorite. I really like Istanbul. It has beautiful architecture. It has the water, all the water that's there, and the boats. There's the boats, and there's mosques and churches and museums. It really is a beautiful place. It has markets. There's a silk market. There's a spice market. There's the Grand Bazaar. There's plenty of stuff to do. Well, one of the things that you'll probably go see if you visit there, because almost every tourist ends up there, is you'll go see the Hagia Sophia, the Blue Mosque, and the Hagia Sophia. And they're kind of across the street from one another. But next to the Blue Mosque, where usually this is where all the buses drop people off, this is where all the taxis drop you off, it's the place that's called the Hippodrome. And it's the remnants of the ancient hippodrome of the ancient city. So this was the center of the city in ancient times. And of course, around that hippodrome today, there are restaurants and things like that. So a lot of people go there as they are touring that part of the city. If you go there, you'll notice a hippodrome. What is a hippodrome? Anybody know? I know, we kind of have an agreement. I talk, and you sit there and watch videos or whatever you're doing. And then, I don't interrupt you, and you don't interrupt me, and we got a nice thing going. But you should know what a hippodrome is. Ancient Rome, the ancient Byzantines. Any guess? Yes, a guess?
No.
You know?
So we're kind of dumb.
Oh, well, it comes from a Greek word, hippus. The hippus drome. A horse. Hey, there you go. Now we're getting it. And so what do you think happens with the horses at the hippodrome? Yeah, races. They're chariot races with horses. So typically there would be a chariot and there would be 4 horses, right? And that had been going on since ancient Greek times. Greek times, Roman times, up into the Byzantine times. People would show up to the hippodromes, and this was a huge event. Thousands and thousands. According to the great hippodrome in Rome, the estimates we have there is that 250,000 people would come to that one. Now this one at Constantinople, maybe not quite that size as a Circus Maximus, the one I'm talking about in Rome, but it would have had hundreds of thousands of people. It probably would have had 150,000 people or more. Anyway, you know what happens when you get that many people together at a sporting event, often? Fights, yes, a lot of fighting, a lot of gambling. You know, if you get like some of these big soccer matches, football matches in Europe, South America, a lot of times they turn into riots. And that's what happened here. It turned into a riot. And the riot began to turn against the emperor. Some of the people didn't like some of his policies. And they got together and said, you know what? The palace is right over there. Let's go get him. And so here they come. The palace guard and others came to the emperor and said, we need to get you out of here. Because there is thousands and thousands of people headed here. And so according to Procopius, Justinian was ready to go, ready to leave. You know who said no? Theodora. Theodora said, we're not leaving. She said, I would rather die in purple than die a pauper. That's what she said. Well, you know, she had been the other. She had been a street dancer with a dancing bear, right? And she had become the empress, and she doesn't want to go back to that kind of life. She liked where she was, and she said, you know what? I'd rather die being the empress, wearing my purple robes, than to run out of here and risk that we lose everything. We're staying. She stayed. Justinian stayed. The soldiers stayed. The riot was put down. Well, that's just one example of how Theodora had influence, had power in the Byzantine Empire. Well, the other thing we need to make sure I highlight here is that the Byzantines were Christians. Remember, Constantine had made Christianity legal in Rome. In fact, he had made all religion legal, which, of course, made Christianity legal. It was later emperors, about 40, 50 years later, that made Christianity the exclusive religion of Rome. And that's the way it had been and was up through the time of Justinian and beyond. The Byzantine Empire was a Christian empire with an emperor. First one they would point back to would be Constantine, but now it's Justinian. Justinian takes his role very seriously, and in fact, what had developed in the Byzantine Empire, whereas in the West, we had a pope, right? The Bishop of Rome becomes the main leader of the church in the West. In the East, they had a strong emperor. And so what they actually did is they merged the idea of being a king or an emperor with the idea of being like the pope or the leader of the church, and they put them together into one person. So that Justinian was both the ruler of the church and the ruler of the state. This is often called Caesaro-papism, like the word Caesar and Pope put together. And he took this seriously. He fought for orthodoxy of the church. When I say orthodoxy, what does that mean? What does it mean if something is orthodox? What's that? Standard. Yeah, that's a pretty good definition. Standard, what we might call
More
traditional, normal. Yes. And you know, in the East, they'd had a lot of trouble with teachings, right? Teachings, especially about Christ. The eastern part of the Roman Empire had major controversy over the person of Christ. Do you remember when I talked about the Goths, and I talked about how the Germanic tribes were Arian or followed Arianism. Remember that? Arianism held to what kind of view of Christ? Anybody remember?
Not God.
Yeah, he was, well, they would say he's God, but he's not equal to God the Father. Yeah, you're right. Subordinate. So you have, okay, so let's see, you've got God the Father, you got God the Son. This was a big thing. Now, how do they relate? According to Arianism, you have God the Father, God the Son. God the Father is above God the Son. God the Father is superior. Christ would then be diminished in his role. He's not equal to God. He is subordinate to God the Father. So they'd still say he's God, but he's not equal with God the Father. Orthodoxy would say God the Father, God the Son, equal. We can throw in there the Holy Spirit, I guess, and say the Trinity. The Trinity is an Orthodox view. All that develops, the development of that is very interesting too. Trinity develops more in the West, that terminology. But in the East, they're very concerned with how does God the Son and God the Father interact? Are they equals, one subordinate? How can it be that God the Son prays to God the Father when he's on earth? Right?
That's what a lot of
And he says, Father, not my will, but your will. Yes?
that's what a lot of people say. I've heard that from a lot of Muslims too. Who are like, how can he pray to himself?
See?
If he's not God.
There you go.
They use that against.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. Yeah, so when you start talking to a Muslim, as I have, one thing they would ask me, they say, well, do you believe in God? I say, yes, I believe in God. They say, do you believe that Jesus is God? I say, yes, I believe Jesus is God. They said, so you believe in two gods? I say, well, no, I don't believe in two gods. I believe in one God. And that's what starts us down this road. So at that point, I usually don't bring up the Holy Spirit. Then they say, I believe in three gods. Right? Anyway. But yes, God the Father, God the Son. So in the East, that was a big question. And one of the main unorthodox ways that it was answered was Arianism. And Arianism said that God the Son was subordinate to God the Father. And of course, that Arian view, that view of Arius, affected the Goths, the Visigoths, and those Germanic tribes, all of which except for, you remember the Merovingians and the Carolingians, the Frankish people were converted to Western Christianity directly, not going through this view of Arianism. Well, we talked about that last week or whatever. We won't do it again here, but that's where it came up again. They had fought a lot about orthodoxy, about right teaching. I guess I'd say orthodoxy could also be, you just call it correct teaching, correct doctrine, right, is orthodox. Well, anyway, he's going to try to do that. He's going to try to get everybody to hold to the right views. He's going to try to clean things up. One of the ways he's going to do that is to close down the Academy of Athens. You remember the Academy of Athens? We talked about it seemingly years ago, clear back probably in September, with ancient Greece. Anybody remember what happens at the Academy of Athens?
Wasn't that a place where all the philosophers like used to teach their philosophy?
Yes, exactly. It was started, most people say, by Plato, and this academy then continues. Remember, that's starting like, 400 BC. We're now up to 500 AD. That's 900 years the academy or so has been around. But, it is mixed in with, according to Justinian, would say, point out that this paganism, Greek gods, Greek goddesses, Greek way of thinking that does a philosophy that does not include sort of the Bible or Christianity to look at God and the world. And so he shut it down. A lot of those philosophers left. Many of them moved into the Muslim world, actually, from there. he also stopped the Olympic Games. The Olympic Games have been going on since 776 BC. And now it's 500 AD. So that's 1,300 years. 1,400 years has been going on. But you know, Greek games were seeped in paganism as well. The god Apollo, Zeus, Hera, you know, a lot of sort of paganism and symbology and so forth, ritual that was tied to Greek religion. And so he wanted to clean things up. So Justinian did that. Now, besides that, he went on a building campaign. He built a lot of churches and a lot of religious structures. He had them built, he remodeled them, he built them from scratch. The one that we had mentioned before, you know, those mosaics where I showed you Justinian and Theodora and mosaics, those were at the Hagia Sophia, as it's called, or Saint Sophia. Sophia means in Greek wisdom. So, holy wisdom, saint wisdom. That was the name of the church. This was the largest church building in the world. From the time it was built in the 500s until the time it was no longer used as a church and was taken over by the Muslims and they converted it into a mosque, which would have been in like 1450s. So almost 1,000 years, over 900 years, this was the largest church structure in the world, largest church building in the world. And it is big. And by the way, St. Peter's Basilica is bigger by a little bit if you go to Rome now, but that wasn't built until the Renaissance period. So it wasn't in existence yet. But it has these big domes with big open areas and balconies, mosaics, frescoes. You know, a lot of these mosaics are made with, in the ceilings and on the walls are made with glass, little pieces, little cubes of glass. And on the back side of the glass is gold foil. Why? So that when the light hits it, it'd reflect off the gold foil like a mirror and come back through the glass of the tile and, you know, just make the stuff glow, make it really light up. So what I'm saying is, spent a lot of money on this. It's a huge structure. And the Blue Mosque, which is sort of across the street, was built much later, but there's no doubt in my mind it was built to try to compete with the Hagia Sophia. You know, the Muslims want to show we'll build a spectacular, or they would believe, a more spectacular building across the street. Well, anyway. And this is where all the Byzantine rulers were crowned, for example, where all the big events took place in the Hagia Sophia. He also built, paid for, St. Catherine's Monastery. Anybody heard of St. Catherine's Monastery? It is the oldest continuously occupied monastery in the world. It has been occupied by Christian monks since about 500 AD. For over 1,500 years now, I would say. There have been Christian monks in St. Catherine's Monastery. St. Catherine's Monastery is associated with a guy named Moses. Maybe you never heard of him. He's in the Bible. Moses. Where did Moses go when he left Egypt? Anybody remember?
They were supposed to go to Canaan.
Canaan?
Well, they were on
Oh, you're talking about, yeah, no, I'm talking about before the Exodus. What's that? Midian?
Midian.
Oh, Midian. Oh, with the Midianites. Well, yeah, he ran into some Midianites. The part of the world where it is today would be called the Sinai Peninsula. It's controlled by Egypt today. It was controlled for a while by Israel. Well, anyway, St. Catherine's Monastery is the southern part of the Sinai Peninsula. It is associated with Moses. The monastery itself had no doors in the walls. It had walls around it with no doors, no gates. How did you get anything in? The guy on the inside lowers down a basket on a rope and hauls it up. Whether that's people or stuff. That's how stuff got in and out. Now, in more modern times, they have built one door that you can go in. You don't have to go in the basket way. But in the 19th century, it was still no doors. In the 20th century, they put a door in. They may block it back up again because they're starting to have more troubles with the people in the area. But it was to keep people out. A guy named Titian came there in like 1885 or something, because of all the books they had there, all the manuscripts, and they had biblical manuscripts. Have you ever heard of the biblical text Sinaiticus? Well, if not, that's where it's from. And you know what he did? This guy checked out books from the library and never brought them back. I have a friend of mine is the librarian. He's a monk at St. Catherine's. And he showed me a picture of the card, the Titian signed, checking out the manuscripts, and they still have never been returned. Now, 40 years later. Probably not going to be returned. But anyway, inside of the monastery, if you go in there, you can go in the courtyard. Up high, I could reach it because I'm tall. There was some vegetation. Moses encountered some vegetation. Do you remember that? What vegetation became very important to Moses? A bush, yes. And what was special about this bush?
It was on fire.
It was on fire. Well, I've seen bushes on fire, burn them up and move on. Why is this one special?
Because it still stayed green.
It stayed green. It was not consumed by the fire. And they say that bush that I touched is the same bush that Moses saw. So thank you. I've seen it. Well, is that the right one? I don't know, but that's what they say. They know. They're monks. And near it is Mount Sinai. When Moses went up, they say this is the place where Moses went up and got the 10 Commandments. So I went there and I walked up the mountain, much like Moses. Well, maybe not anything like Moses, but I walked up the mountain. To go there, it gets very hot there. 40 degrees Celsius is not uncommon. It gets higher than that. It can get 100, 120 degrees, stuff like that. So if you're climbing up a mountain at 120 degrees in the sun, that's pretty hot. So what do people do? They go in the nighttime. I took a hydrofoil across the Red Sea, and I got to the harbor, and a guy's waiting there. Guys are waiting there in their little taxi kind of cabs. And you hire the guy for like 28 hours. I mean, almost as long as it's going to take some people to get to Virginia. And then the guy puts you in the car, and he drives you to the village near the monastery, and there's a little place where you could stay. And so you get a room there, and you stay, and you eat a little food, and then you try to sleep. But the guy says, hey, I'm coming back to get you at 11 o'clock, 11:30, something like that. So at 11:15 or so, you go down, you get in the car, and this guy drives you to the monastery. You see it at night. Everything's dark. And the guy just sits, he sits in the parking lot waiting for you when you're at the hotel. He sits there at the near the monastery. Of course, he knows you're going to be a while, so I think he probably takes off and goes sleeps for a while. Then he comes back to get you. And what do? You walk about 4 hours to get up to the top of Mount Sinai. It's It's a long, winding path up a mountain. And the last part of it is just steps. I don't remember how many. About 700 of them. Something like that. 600, 700 of them. With no railings, it's just steps going up the side of the mountain. When you get up to the top there, you find some other people there. And everybody sits and waits for the sun to rise. And you see the sunrise on Mount Sinai. And you take your obligatory pictures. By the way, there's a guy up there selling some food. By that point, you're kind of hungry. So you're happy to buy some of his food and some water to drink and stuff. And then you wait, and the sunrise comes up, you take your pictures, and then you go down the mountain, same way, about 4 hours down. Takes you almost as long. And I remember when I came down the mountain, you could see the monastery there, and I see some buses, people coming. They were coming in, tourists in the morning. And I saw, getting off of this bus, what I'm going to call church ladies, because I think that's what they were. And they were kind of dressed like church ladies. And they came up to me, and they said, I don't know why they thought they could speak to me in English, but they did. And they said, excuse me, do you know how to get to Mount Sinai? We're looking for Mount Sinai. I said, well, it's right there. That's Mount Sinai. Oh, okay. How do we get up there? Were you up there? I said, yeah, I was up there. I said, well, you just follow this path. You can go up there. But I said, I think you ought to know that when I started up there around midnight last night, and I'm just getting back now. It takes you about 4 hours to get up there. Well, we only have 35 minutes, they told us on the bus. I said, well, you probably don't want to try that. There it is. You can take a picture of it. You should go look at the monastery. You know. Anyway, that was my encounter with church ladies at Mount Sinai. They did not go up there, I was glad to say. They decided not to, because
Were they older?
I think they would have had some troubles. Anyway, it was starting to get hot then. I mean, I went up in the middle of the night. They would have been going up when it's starting to heat up in the day.
Did you climb like 4 hours just by yourself?
By myself.
That'd be boring.
Yeah, well, much of my life is. Anyway, let's go on. Well, I mean, there were some other people. I didn't know them. Actually, I climbed up there with a bunch of Mormons. There were a lot of Mormons. Yeah, but that's a whole other story. Well, I overheard their conversations, which were far more interesting. They were almost as interesting as somebody telling you they're going to like sit in a bus stop for 7 hours in Richmond, Virginia with a Burger King a half a mile away. Stuff like that. The Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is in Jerusalem. And it's a church. It was a church originally. It's now a mosque. It's up on top near the Dome of the Rock. And it was a church that was built at this time, later used by the Crusaders as a church as well. Of course, beautiful mosaics and beautiful churches. The churches were built in a basilica style. I'm going to show you a diagram of that. Basilica comes from a Greek word, which means king. And this was used by the Romans as a government building, as a sort of a judgment hall, a courthouse. Okay? But the Christians adapt that building style and even the name, and they put their churches in basilicas. I guess because God's the king, right? And this is the king's building. Well, this is what they look like. I slaved over a hot monitor to make you this diagram. Well, this is a rough outline of a basilica-style building or church. The Romans used would have been the middle part here, the nave and the central apse. That would have been it. But Christians then very quickly will begin to add an aisle, sometimes just one on one side, but normally one on either side. And it was always in this direction, north and south, east and west. Why would they have a particular direction for their church? And up until recently, all church buildings had this direction. Not pointing towards Jerusalem, but you are in the right sort of neighborhood. A direction has to do with something important. You know, in the Bible, I keep recommending this book to you, there is discussion of someone named Jesus, that he would return. Where is he going to return? Where does he appear when he returns? Nobody knows.
Where he left from?
You will see him in the sky. Where? In the east. Jesus will appear in the east. The church faces the east. So that if you walk in the building and you look towards the front, you're looking to the east. And why are you looking to the east? Because Jesus will return in the east. And you don't want to miss it. And in fact, Christian burials, I don't know about anymore, but for thousands of years, Christians were buried so that if they sat up in the grave, they would be looking east. Because when Jesus comes and you come back to life and you sit up in the grave, you're going to see him. At least that was the idea. So if I'm in the Middle East digging and I find a grave, I can pretty much tell you what religion the person is by just the direction of their bones. They're facing east, they're a Christian. If they're facing south, they're a Muslim. Okay? Those are usually the ones that I get. If they're Romans, they go in any direction they want.
What's the coolest thing you found while you were digging?
Coolest thing I've found, oh boy. That's hard to say. We did dig up an unrobbed first century Roman tomb. And it had slots back in there with bodies had been put in coffins and put back in there. You could see the outline of the cedar wood coffin. You could see all the bones were articulated, just laid out there. You could see around the bone a gold ring on the woman's hand. Gold looked pretty good. Her, not so much. And in her abdomen, fetal bones of an unborn child. With it, pots and lamps, and that was pretty neat. Is that the neatest? I don't know. Pretty neat though.
Where was that at?
It was in northern Jordan, a place called Abila. I also dug up a greater than life-size statue of Artemis. Had a few parts missing, but she was there. Her leg, her torso. I guess both her legs, her torso. Anyway, that was pretty neat. We find coins, we find other objects. Well, anyway, I also worked on a church building. I've dug up church buildings. And then here you find mosaic floors. Sometimes you find buried in one of these apses bones of a martyr. And this chapel, this side chapel would be dedicated, say, to that martyr. In one church, not one that I dug up, but one that dug up in Jordan, they actually found scrolls in the North Apse. So anyway, this kind of setup is normal. Triapsoidal basilica. Well, another thing, if any of you are interested in the law or being a lawyer, anything to do with that, if you're trying to avoid going to prison, you might want to know that Justinian reorganized Roman law in his time period, and that reorganization has become the basis of Western European law, and therefore much of our American law as well. You can trace a lot of our laws and different codes and principles back to English law. The English law you can trace back to the Byzantines. The Byzantines you can trace back to the Romans. And so it was Justinian who preserved the Roman law and who reintroduced it. It was reintroduced, he didn't do it, but it was reintroduced in the 12th century to Western Europe and then becomes the basis of much of European law. So he's got the law code, he's got the cleaning up the church, he's got building lots of pretty amazing buildings, he's got expanding the empire, he does a lot. But then finally it comes to decline. Most people trace it back to 548 when Theodora dies. She dies of disease. She's 20 years younger than him, but he outlives her. He is shaken, his treasury is depleted because he had built so many things and he had led so many military campaigns, paid for his army, paid for these lavish buildings, paid for gold and mosaics and so forth. And with his wife gone and his money dwindling, he is shaken. And then, of course, leading up to this was a disease, a plague. Was it the Black Plague? Most people say maybe not. But anyway, a terrible disease hits Constantinople, cripples this area for about 2 to 3 years, and a lot of people die. Justinian himself will live another, well, not quite 20 years after his wife. He dies in 565, still with much of his empire intact, but shortly after his death, his empire will crumble, and we'll see the Byzantine Empire keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller over the years, but it will continue until the mid-15th century. So this empire is around well over 1,000 years. The next screen shows you 3 maps put side by side, all 3 of them of the Byzantine Empire. Here it is in 550 at its height under Justinian. You go up about, 450 years? They've lost all of this stuff. They lost all of this territory to the Muslims. Remember, the Muslims come through here in the 7th century, and they take over the Holy Land of the Middle East. They take over Egypt and North Africa, and they actually move into Spain as well, if you remember that. And so the Byzantines are left with the southern part of Italy, Greece, Turkey. And then you go up another 300 years, and the Ottoman Turks have been, you remember we said the Crusades were when the Byzantine Emperor wanted the Western people to come, Christians, to help him fight against the Muslims who were taking his territory over here. And of course, eventually they win that. We call it Turkey today. So the Ottoman Turks won, but they still had territory up here, Bulgaria and that sort of area. But then finally, about 100 years later, all the territory up here had been lost, and it was just the city of Constantinople that remained intact. It had strong walls around it. It had water access to it. It was a very difficult city to take. They had a big chain across the harbor. So if the boats tried to come in, they would be blocked by the chain. So Mehmet, the Conqueror, he is called. He came up with a plan. He actually had his men carry the boats overland around the chain into the other part of the harbor. and they laid assault on the city, and they take it in 1453. And that's when Constantinople falls to the Muslims, to the Turks, the Ottoman Turks. They change its name to Istanbul. You can still go to the Museum of Constantinople, or Museum of Istanbul, and you can see a part of that chain is still there. Well, we will end it there for today.